Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining the third in a series of offshore wind educational events hosted by the Uniting the Central Coast for Action, a program of the Slow Climate Coalition. These events are focused on informing and inspiring local clean energy development and resilience. The first event focused on why to consider offshore wind, looking at climate change, its impact on the ocean, and environmental justice. The second featured speeches from the California Energy Commission and the Federal Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, presenting their regulatory processes. The recordings of the first two events are available via our website, slowclimatecoalition.org, or you can find them on the Slow Climate Coalition YouTube channel. Answers to the questions posed during the first event were sent to the event registrants this morning. Sorry for the delay, but it's a quite comprehensive response. I am John Smigelski. I lead the Uniting the Central Coast for Action program. My teammates and I are excited to bring you today's event. Today we'll hear about the potential impacts of offshore wind on California's Central Coast. We're going to hear from our presenters first, then have a Q&A session at the end. During the presentations, please enter your questions to our speakers in the Q&A feature in Zoom. In the final segment, our moderator will direct those questions to one or more of the speakers. Note, we'll be only fielding questions about today's presentations. If we can't get to all the questions today, we'll seek to answer any remaining in writing afterwards. The Slow Climate Coalition deeply appreciates the support. Sorry, changing slides. These support of our partner organizations with help promote this webinar. We continue to work with our partners, with you and our audience, to further the transition to clean energy and develop resilience in our communities. Our moderator for this webinar will be Anastasia Telesky, Professor of Environmental and Climate Change Law with a focus on ocean governance at California Polytechnic State University. She is also a member of the California Sea Grant, whose mission is to provide integrated research, extension, outreach, and education to help California balance diverse interests that intersect with coastal and marine environments. Dr. Telesky holds a law degrees from the University of British Columbia and the University of California, Berkeley. Anastasia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So welcome again to all of our participants in the webinar. Today, we're going to be hearing from 4 subject matter experts, and each of these experts is going to be addressing one aspect of potential impacts of the offshore, floating offshore wind development projects. First of all, we'll be hearing from Dr. Brandon Southall, who is the founder and president of the Southall Environmental Associates in Santa Cruz. This is a research and consulting business that is applying science to support environmentally responsible development. He is also a research associate with UC Santa Cruz and an adjunct assistant professor at Duke University. Additionally, he has directed the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Ocean Acoustics program and has been involved in developing systematic noise exposure criteria for marine mammals and the first ever acoustic guidelines for the agency. So we will be hearing from him now, and while you're listening to the presentation, please do post your questions in the Q&A feature and keep your questions focused on the topics that are being covered by our speakers today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can't see you though. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Are you seeing the slides though?
I can see the slides, but not you.
We see you now.
Okay. I think my video's on. I can see myself. Okay. Great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the chance to be part of this discussion on this really important and timely, locally, nationally, and internationally relevant topic. I'm going to speak to some of the science and the knowns and unknowns related to acoustics, underwater acoustics. I am a bioacoustician. I've studied sound behavior and the impacts of noise on hearing and behavior in the laboratory at Long Marine Lab in Santa Cruz, where I did my PhD, in kind of a policy science interface when I worked for NOAA, as mentioned, and in a research capacity, doing field experiments and monitoring projects to look at the effects of human noise on the behavior and underwater acoustics of marine mammals. So just a very brief primer that many people probably know. The physics of water really favor the use of sound as a communication channel. Light behaves very differently, doesn't penetrate the ocean as well. Chemical signals are mixed and not as useful as they are in terrestrial environments. Tactile signals are useful, but only on really close ranges, and sound travels efficiently and far. And animals, you know, in the case of fish, hundreds of millions of years ago, and in the case of marine mammals, tens of millions of years ago, have really adapted to prioritize sound as the primary communication channel that they utilize for essentially all important things that they do: finding their way around, detecting predators, feeding. Some of them use active acoustics in the case of dolphins and porpoises for echolocation and foraging, reproductive signals, many of the beautiful sounds you hear from humpback whales in social interactions and communication and reproduction, taking care of their young. So there's really no question that sound is critical to these animals. And people sort of figured out the same physics when they went underwater and tried to find things, which is that sound is the right way to do that. And we make sound either on purpose to find things like sonar systems or oil and gas surveys to penetrate the subsurface and look at the bottom and plate tectonics and research things, or we make sound unintentionally as a byproduct of things like moving cargo on ships or pile driving to install offshore facilities such as those used in offshore wind. And it raises a lot of key questions, and my career has kind of been dedicated to trying to address some of these, and some of them is how can we use technology, listening technology, and other kinds of acoustic or particle motion type sensing technology that tells us where animals are and how they're behaving, things about their distribution. How do we utilize technology and monitoring to understand what the negative impacts are? And when we can identify some of those and identify their severity and things that we want to try and reduce, what can we do to try and reduce those impacts? I was pretty involved in some of the quieting guidance for the International Maritime Organization, and things like bubble curtains around offshore wind are examples of kind of mitigation technologies. The range of things that can happen are, and I've ordered them here sort of from the most common to the least common, and from the sort of least bad to the worst. So as you go from the top to the bottom of this, probably the most common thing that happens is kind of like what happens to you if you're in a city and there's a lot of sounds. Most of them, you know, aren't going to have a discernible, you know, observable impact on you. That doesn't necessarily mean that they might not have physiological effects at some level. People that live in cities have higher cortisol than people that live in the country, for instance. But, you know, the kind of absence of a clear and discernible response is probably the most common thing that can happen. But then you get into kind of interference with communication or perception. The most common of those is probably things such as auditory masking, which again would happen to you in a city. You can't hear someone as far away speaking at the same level in a city as you can in the countryside. That's the kind of simultaneous interference with sound communication. More severe and sort of closer to the source, or more less likely type of effects, are temporary or permanent changes in hearing, and some of the work we've done in laboratories has given us a handle on what some of those levels are, which are really quite high levels. And then there's a whole host of behavioral responses. And in some of these noise criteria that was referenced, we've put these in sort of a severity ranking based on their impacts on vital functions like feeding, social interactions, predation, habitat abandonment, some of which have been demonstrated in certain contexts. And then probably the least common thing that can happen, but the most visible one, and actually part of the issue that drove the awareness of sound and its impacts on animals to the forefront, at least regarding military sonars, are stranding events that are mortal outcomes of sound interaction with animals. And we've gotten a pretty good handle on what the kind of conditions and contexts of some of those are. So that's just kind of the whole suite of things that can happen. And I tried to put this together to kind of relate what I think we know kind of generally about potential impacts of offshore wind. And I'm trying to relate some of these to where we are with our knowledge and the context on the West Coast specifically. So I've worked with the wind developers and science and monitoring efforts in Europe for almost 10 years. I'm working actively on the East Coast on a couple of monitoring projects, one of which I'll mention, and pretty actively involved in some of the consideration on the West Coast as well. And we kind of, our knowledge of impacts, goes from, I would say a substantial and kind of mature level in some of the contexts in Europe, an emerging and increasingly informed level on the East Coast, but still relatively new, and then really kind of a whole new set of issues that we're dealing with out here on the West Coast. So in terms of those direct auditory impacts, some of those are possible, but I think the most likely types of things would be things like masking in areas where you have concentrations of vessels at certain times that typically don't have vessels in them, at least currently. And these temporary and permanent threshold shift things, they're possible at relatively close ranges to really high impact things like high impact pile driving of large monopiles, as is happening on the East Coast, especially with floating wind. That's just really not likely a very big area that's likely to occur in. And some of these things are mediated by behavior. If the animals avoid some of these areas behaviorally, they're not likely to sit around and get to levels that cause temporary or permanent threshold shifts. Some of the behavioral impacts are also certainly possible. We've seen things demonstrated in terms of aversion with animals like harbor porpoises in the North Sea. And we do have a good amount of data on that, but we have new species on the East Coast and West Coast of the U.S. with large whales, that are more sensitive to low frequencies. And here on the West Coast, we have this really different context of deep water and some species like beaked whales that are particularly sensitive behaviorally, and sperm whales that are ESA listed that just don't exist in the two other sort of larger areas that these things have been developed in. And then one other consideration for behavioral effects, especially with floating, where you have these large platforms, is attraction and prey items being drawn into areas that animals like marine mammal predators might be drawn towards. In terms of strandings and mortality, there's no evidence that we have association with offshore wind. That's counter to some pretty extensive misinformation on the East Coast that's been pretty clearly debunked by a number of people, but including this paper by Leslie Thorne and Dave Wiley. And really, I think that especially from the kind of acoustic sources associated with floating wind, it's really just not something that I think scientists are concerned about. For acoustically, I think we have some new contexts and some unknowns in terms of other potential mortal considerations, especially things like entanglement, and not just primary entanglement, but secondary entanglement. And if we can get into the discussion of that, I could expand on that a little bit. And also, concerns about vessel strikes on species like blue whales that we know are sensitive to those things. And one key gap, it's just important to note, is we don't have a lot of of information on the where, when, and why, and some of the densities for some of our key protected species, especially in certain months of the year. Okay, two last quick things I wanted to highlight, and I won't justify either one of these things with one slide, but there's a project that Duke is leading called Wildlife and Offshore Wind that is using a whole bunch of tools, passive acoustics, tagging technologies. I've been involved in some of the tagging in New York, tissue and eDNA and blow sampling, environmental prey sampling, and using these integrated regional ecosystem assessments in 2 different wind energy areas in and around the development and deployment of offshore wind. There's a lot of people involved on the science side, conservation groups, NGOs, environmental organizations, other environmental organizations, universities, companies, and that there's an external advisory board that includes some other NGOs as well as some of the companies themselves. And we're working in these 2 areas off Nantucket, Rhode Island area, and off of New York, the New York Bight, to use all of these technologies to look at birds, bats, marine mammals, and integrate some of those technologies to look at the before, the during, which is occurring, and the operational phases of several of these wind energy areas. And another thing that I won't get into do any real justice to, but actually that started in the Morro Bay area around a seismic survey that was proposed a decade ago, was using, instead of these sort of single noise thresholds, using risk assessment methods where we're really looking at space and time, multiple sources, and ways of integrating the severity of responses and the vulnerability of different species to look at scenarios where we could say, what if we did 1 pile a day or 2 piles a day, or used different start months. And I'll just leave that at that to say that risk assessment methods, I think, are kind of a forefront of how we're dealing with some of these these kind of novel impacts. And then the last slide that I have here is just to highlight that there's a process ongoing being led by the California Marine Sanctuary Foundation with funding from the California Ocean Protection Council to develop monitoring guidance for marine mammals and seabirds in California. There was this kind of series of webinars on that. There's a website at the bottom there that's looking at marine mammals and turtles, birds and bats, ecology, habitats and ecosystems, and that's just the sort of science groups. There's also a number of community input and engagement on different levels there. So I'm gonna leave that. We can come back to it if we want. And I think with that, I will turn back to you, Anastasia, and stand by for questions.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we'll be asking some more substantive questions at the end, but just real quick, we had a question come in for one of the acronyms that you were using.
Sure.
And if you don't mind, PTS, TTS, what those acronyms were.
Sorry, I went a little quick there. Do I have them just acronymed on there? I guess I do. Temporary threshold shift is that's when you're hearing changes temporarily, and you essentially become less sensitive to noise. It's kind of analogous to what happens to your eyes when you go into a movie theater. You get less sensitive to light, and when you come out, everything seems bright. There's different grades of that. That's kind of the least grade of it, and then some of them take longer to return, where your hearing threshold your sensitivity takes longer to return to normal. And if it never returns to normal, that's called permanent threshold shift, or PTS.
Thank you very much for that clarification. And we're going to be shifting to our next speaker, but real quick, there was another very brief question. What is floating offshore wind? Floating offshore wind, there are 2 types of wind. We have fixed wind. This is being pursued primarily on the East Coast. The current projects in places like New York are fixed wind projects where they're connected to the seabed floor, floating directly connected with a pile. And the floating offshore wind will have mooring cables that will then have an anchor that will be connected to the seabed floor. It's really our only option in deep water. And that's the proposals for all of the wind development here on the West Coast are floating offshore wind. And folks can answer more on that at the end. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mike Conroy, who has joined us here as a principal of the West Coast Fisheries Consultants. This is a company that works with commercial and recreational fisheries along the West Coast. Mike's been involved with offshore wind policies and activities since 2018. He is co-chair of the Pacific Fishery Management Council's Marine Planning Committee, as well as vice chair of the council's Highly Migratory Species Advisory Subpanel. He is also serving on the California Offshore Wind Energy Fisheries Working Group. So he's coming to us with a wealth of experience. So over to you, Mike.
Yeah, thanks for that, Anastasia. I'm confirming you can both hear me and see what I've got on the screen.
Both. Thank you.
Perfect. Well, you saved me a lot of time in the sense that I don't have to reintroduce who I am. You did splendidly at that, and I thank you. As she mentioned, I've been deeply involved in the offshore wind planning process since call areas were announced in 2018. Just for clarification, it's the process that led to the leasing of the areas off Morro Bay and off Humboldt. And that has caused us the most pain. That has caused the most pain with ocean user stakeholder groups. Offshore wind is being done to us, not with us, involving the shipping and fishing industries early in the process could result in siting decisions made that would have avoided or at least greatly minimized impacts to our industries. So just real briefly, just kind of an overview of what the presentation will look like. You've already heard who I am. With regard to floating offshore wind facilities, what they may look like. We don't know exactly what a project off Morro Bay looks like, but we do have some depictions on what it may look like. And because we don't know what these facilities will look like, we can only at this time really imagine what the impacts will be to fisheries and the communities that are dependent upon those activities. Having said that, that based on the depictions you will see, we can differentiate between expected impacts and those that are only potential impacts. Make no mistake that there will be impacts to fisheries and fishing communities. The degree and severity remains unknown at this time. Then I will briefly mention some efforts that are underway to fill data gaps and collect science that will help inform the degree and severity of the impacts to the fishing communities. So onward, and these next two slides just are meant to give you a high-level overview of what a offshore wind farm might look like, a floating offshore wind. This fairly represents what we could see off Morro Bay. I do note this is for Humboldt, but this also could apply what we expect to see off Morro Bay. One thing that could be of interest to folks is the potential use of offshore converter stations. This would convert AC power to DC before being transmitted ashore. One of these has been proposed off the East Coast. Seawater is utilized to cool the equipment used in the conversion process. The seawater at temps that could reach 90 degrees is then discharged back into the marine environment. This slide shows what infrastructure supporting floating offshore wind looks like and how it could negatively impact fisheries. These inter-array cables you see sort of suspended in the water column between the two turbines will functionally close lease areas to most types of fishing activities. The anchoring schemes, as you see depicted on this screen here, also could negatively impact sensitive habitats that are important to both fish and other marine species. I thought before going into the impacts that we expect to see or could potentially see for the fishing industry, I thought it would be important to kind of give folks an idea who are unfamiliar with the fishing industry, an idea of the challenges that are facing fishing communities in addition to offshore wind. The 30 by 30 efforts, that's both federal and at the state level. And these are looking at excluding fisheries from more areas in support of efforts to conserve 30% of state lands and waters by 2030. In terms of fishery management, I would say anybody in Morro Bay, ask your local fishermen about the Dungeness crab or salmon fisheries and how fisheries management implications are affecting their abilities to operate. We'll talk more about fisheries management and the potential uncertainty that could arise given offshore wind a little bit later on. Pollution, I'm talking here in terms of plastics, urban runoff, and how that impacts domoic acid, et cetera. Those are things that we're also dealing with. Changing ocean conditions. while the West Coast in recent years is experiencing lower than normal water temps, I do think it's important to we at least acknowledge that changing ocean conditions are something that's happening. To the extent these are linked with climate change is a high likelihood. I do think it's important to note that according to the operators of the Vineyard Wind project on the East Coast, as noted in their environmental impact statement, offshore wind is not expected to have any impacts on climate change. So to the extent that we're looking at that, I think it's important to identify that as well. Industrialization of the marine space, not only for offshore wind, but also plans for aquaculture, wave and tidal energy projects, and a recent rumor that has been circulating with regard to underwater server farms to support data needs and AI needs as well. And then just a lack of opportunity. A groundfish fisherman from Morro Bay who is displaced from his or her fishing grounds is not free to transition to another fishery. So that's something to think about when we start to get into the meat of my presentation. So let's talk about expected and potential impacts to fishing communities. Why do I use the word potential here? Because there are no large-scale floating offshore wind projects ending in the world. Nobody, not BOEM, not the state or federal agencies, not the developers, can tell you with any degree of certainty what may happen to fisheries and or fishing communities, the marine environment and ecosystem, or habitats as a result of achieving the state's long-term planning goal of roughly 4,000 square miles of offshore wind farms off the California coast. Throughout this presentation, I'll continue to use the word fishing community rather than fishermen or harvesters or recreational or commercial fishermen. This term is defined under federal law and includes fishing vessel owners, operators, and crews, and processors that are based in such community. This goes to highlight that impacts to fishermen, commercial and recreational, will have downstream impacts to others in the local community. So based on the slides that we showed earlier depicting what a floating offshore wind array may look like, this allows us to identify impacts to commercial and or recreational fisheries that are expected. These include the loss of access to important fishing grounds for those gear types that'll be functionally barred from operating with those leased areas. For example, pot fisheries, trap fisheries, any fisheries that operate near or closer to the bottom will not be able to operate within the confines of a wind array because of the suspended inter-array cables in the water column. These fishermen will be forced to move their operations to other areas, which will negatively impact fishermen in those areas via increased crowding and competition. Any reduction in our state's fishermen' ability to provide a healthy and nutritious source of protein will necessarily impact our food security and increase our reliance on imported seafood, which typically has a much higher carbon footprint and much less concern for biodiversity protection that our fishery management structures are based upon. And finally, with regard to fisheries management, quotas and harvest levels are based on long-running data sets collected from NOAA surveys that are conducted across the West Coast, including within the lease sites. To the extent that these surveys are disrupted, i.e. you can't conduct data collection efforts within those lease areas, this will result in less confidence in the data sets that are used to inform fisheries management, which will lead to reduced quotas and catch levels due to the scientific uncertainty. And just, I have an ETC there, examples of other expected impacts include safety at sea. That'll be discussed more below, but this is with regard to marine radars. We already know that turbines impact marine radars. There are efforts afoot to develop marine radar systems that won't be distorted by turbines, but those don't exist yet. And then also increased costs, particularly with regard to fuel, incurred in having to avoid the wind farms to get to and from port in your areas of where fishermen fish. The remaining impacts are listed as potential because at present there isn't enough information to say whether or not these will come into fruition. So for example, with regard to the ecosystem, we are seeing studies come from the North Sea that are showing that offshore wind is having a negative impact on primary productivity. Negative impacts to the low levels of the food chain will have cascading effects throughout the marine environment. There are also concerns on offshore wind wakes and how that will impact upwelling off the West Coast, which is the primary driver of productivity here off the West Coast. As the prior presenter noted, We need to know more about the behavior patterns of marine resources. If whale migratory patterns change as a result of offshore wind developments, there is a very real concern about impacts to fixed gear fisheries that operate out the state of California. There is also concern about how finfish and seabirds may alter their behavior and how those alterations may impact fisheries. Some studies on electromagnetic fields, or EMFs, have shown that crustaceans are negatively impacted. Certain species of crab enter a catatonic state and die from starvation. There is also concern about how the fields may affect the ability of salmon to return to their river of birth. In addition to the impacts of marine radars identified above, many questions are unanswered about the ability of the United States Coast Guard to conduct search and rescue operations around and within a wind farm. And then pollution, I throw this in here. You know, the notion, as I noted earlier, the notion of heated water being discharged into the marine environment, often at temperatures 30 degrees above the ambient water temperature, is a concern. Based on projects proposed on the East Coast, we should expect each turbine will hold thousands of gallons of pollutants, whether that's oils, coolants, or grease. The threat of discharge is a very real concern. Just in October of 2021, hundreds of square miles of prime fishing grounds in Southern California were closed as a result of oil pollution. And then also turbine failures. You know, the Vineyard Wind project on the East Coast 2 months ago had a turbine blade failure that caused beaches to close on the East Coast. And since then, there have been reports of turbine failures in Europe as well. And we also have to be mindful of the cumulative impacts of offshore wind developments on all of the impacts identified above. This is an area that is ripe for research. And just my second to last slide is, you know, thankfully there are efforts to fill data gaps that are currently underway. I've just highlighted a few of them here on the screen, and when I'm done, I will throw links to the 2 NMFS, National Marine Fisheries Service studies, into the chat for folks on reading. It is encouraging that we are starting to see more research being focused on getting a better understanding of the trade-offs that can be expected from offshore wind development, so informed decisions can be made. And with that, I thank you, and I will hand it back over to you.
Thank you very much. One quick clarifying question that came in on the chat. There was a comment that wind energy has no impact on climate change. The question is, are you referring to it not having a larger carbon footprint, and that it will not reduce the fossil fuel, rather than not reducing fossil fuel use? Can you please?
Yeah, no, that's a great, thank you. And I greatly appreciate that question. So in the final actually it was in the supplemental impact statement that was submitted by the Vineyard Wind developers and to BOEM, it clearly states in there that offshore wind will have little to no impact on climate change. Whether or not that considers the potential reduction in fossil fuel use, they didn't clarify that. I mean, let's be clear, the wind doesn't blow at all times. So there are going to have to be, you know, oil and gas burning facilities standing by to operate for when the wind isn't working, or for when the wind isn't blowing. So thanks for that question. I appreciate it.
Thanks for the clarification. We're going to move on to our next speaker, who is Suzy Watkins. She is with the Port San Luis Harbor as the director, and she will be speaking to us about potential harbor impacts. She came to us from the County of Ventura, where she was previously the deputy director at the Channel Islands Harbor, and was previously managing the countywide debt issuance and the capital development portfolio there. She has served 3 years as the chair of the California Marine Affairs and Navigation Conference, representing the statewide system of ports and harbors, and is currently the immediate past chair of that particular organization. She has an MBA from California Lutheran University, and she will be speaking to us on ports. And just a quick reminder to all of our participants, please do post your questions again in the Q&A feature. We've heard a couple topics now on marine mammals and acoustics, and on fishing impacts, and questions related to these topics. Thank you very much. Over to you, Suzy.
Thank you. And just to confirm that my audio is working?
It is working.
Thank
And
you.
your screens, your slides are showing. Thank you.
Perfect. Yeah, just a quick note on my title slide here. I really appreciate this series of images that illustrate more than 120 years of use at Harford Pier, one of the 3 piers in our water area. You can see going from the top, you can see the Murray Hotel on the far left. You see the narrow gauge railway taking goods in and out from the ships out on the extended Harford Pier. Got shortened a little bit, and down at the bottom you see the most current configuration. So we have evolved over time and expect to continue doing so. And what we're doing right now is investigating how that can happen and what choices may be made. For those who are not familiar with us, I'll just touch on a brief overview. The district, our political boundaries actually stretch from San Luis Obispo down to Nipomo and includes both coastal and inland areas. However, the physical area of responsibility is the State Tidelands Trust. And we have about 100 acres of land and 8,400 acres of tidelands you see outlined in red on this image. That is the area of direct influence for our 5-member elected Board of Commissioners. And our landside assets include developments such as the Flying Flags RV Park. Zooming in a little bit, this is our active operational area that we are more commonly talking about. Just off the image to the left is our breakwater that shelters all of our vessels from a majority of incoming swell, with the exception of some southerly swell in the winter. Moving from the left, we have Harford Pier, which is about 1,300 feet long for reference. Cal Poly Pier in the center is about 3,000 feet long, and it gets out to deeper water. And the Avila Pier, our pedestrian pier to the right, is about 1,700 feet long. These piers were constructed over the last 100 plus years to serve a variety of uses, commercial, tourism, import-export of numerous goods and products, and they are all still standing and serving our community. For offshore wind at Port San Luis, we do not have quantified impacts yet. We are at the very beginning of this process. Our board's approach has been very deliberate and fact-based. We were identified in multiple studies as a high potential locations to provide operations and maintenance support for the offshore wind area. This image, you can see the offshore wind lease areas outlined in black out in the open water in the federal waters, so that is not under our direct influence. Port San Luis is down in the lower right of this image. And we do have, as I mentioned, a commercial and public serving history as a regional economic hub. We have partnership with Cal Poly and clean energy research, as well as marine academic applications. In 2022, it's important to note, SLO County partnered on the 2022 REACH infrastructure study that identified as a high-end possibility, a large concept that required 80 to 100 acres. That is a large industrial port that is not proposed and has not been proposed to actually be developed here. It was an illustration, and REACH has recently clarified that that is not a proposal that's being acted on. In 2023, our board adopted a resolution directing staff to participate in conversations and collect information to allow further discussion of wind energy uses in district waters and on district property. So where we are now is we are beginning 2 studies. One is a deep water port feasibility study that is led by the County of SLO and will take the next 4 to 6 months. The district also began a project evaluation agreement with Clean Energy Terminals The difference between these two studies is the county is a regional planning effort. It is what is known as a top-down study. That means it begins with very general assumptions and looks downward into how those assumptions might be followed up on. CET is doing a bottom-up study. They already have an idea that they would like to pursue the potential for an operations and maintenance hub in district waters. So their project evaluation agreement, they are starting with that premise and doing more technical evaluations on how and if that is feasible operationally, financially, a number of other aspects. And then that will in turn be reviewed by Clean Energy Terminals as well as by the district board to see if there's mutual agreement to move forward with an identified project. But on both of these studies, stakeholder engagement is a critical element. And as I mentioned, both are just beginning. So thank you to everyone who is watching this for taking the time to learn about where we're at this time and where we will be going. So what is an operations and maintenance facility? And thank you to Clean Energy Terminals. They developed the image on the left as an example to provide some context for discussion. This is not their proposal. This is not a real facility. And you can see a number of notes on it. There's actually some additional explanation to this image that is available on the Clean Energy's Terminal website, which is where I picked it up from. But you can see, looking at the image, that the O&M facility on the marine side includes vessel berth. The illustration, I believe, is a 250-foot vessel at a 3,000-foot pier, as an example, because you do need that depth of water for these type of vessels. The vessels generally call once every 2 to 3 weeks to resupply and change crews. They're in for 12 to 24 hours. And there is some landside facilities, 3 to 5 acres, that are needed. They may or may not be immediately adjacent to the pier. They can be located at some distance away, and that would be evaluated as part of that study. So the evaluation factors, both in determining whether to move forward as well as moving forward in a design of a potential facility, if one is identified as feasible, include both land and marine traffic, biological impacts, other environmental impacts, economic impacts, views for visitors and residents, and the answers to these and many other questions will be developed as part of that evaluation process. As I said, since we don't have a proposed project at this time, we do not have direct impacts to discuss. We are looking forward to engaging with the public once we've proceeded through the studies. Those studies will assess current conditions and hold them up against the constraints, both environmental and physical, and the operational requirements of an O&M facility. What we would request from the public is to please do stay engaged, stay informed, and work through this with us. Community engagement will be ongoing. Additional information will be provided at portsanlouis.com. Clean Energy Terminals also has a website, cleanenergyterminals.com. And today we added the portsanlouis.com. If you click on the alerts on the front page, it takes you where you can sign up to receive alerts. And down, I believe it's near the middle of that page, is a specific checkbox to be notified when we are conducting outreach efforts for offshore wind. And we will be scheduling that starting in the next few months as soon as we get our outreach team on board. I'm available for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll be having some questions, I'm sure, at the end. And as a reminder, please do put your questions in the Q&A feature. We're going to hear from our last speaker, and then we'll bring everyone together again to answer the questions that you folks have been posing. Our next speaker will be Patrick Duffy. who is the offshore wind energy analyst at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. He focuses his work on developing tools and analysis to better understand cost and technology needs related to different energy sources. This includes supporting various government agencies and state grid planning efforts. He has done work on floating offshore wind technology costs and feasibility studies and market reports. Prior to working with NREL, he graduated from the European Wind Energy Master Joint Program at the Technical University of Denmark and the Delft University of Technology, with Masters of Science degrees in wind energy and aerospace engineering. So we'll turn it over to you to share a little bit of the economics with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thanks for having me today. You know, I appreciate the comments from the previous speakers. I think those were interesting talks. Hopefully I can add a little bit more perspective about offshore wind energy technology costs today. So like we just mentioned, my role as an offshore wind techno-economic analyst at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory focuses on developing tools and capabilities to understand cost impacts from different technology choices, as well as how technology costs may evolve over time and space. So yeah, just want to mention I'm from California. I grew up in San Jose, and looking forward to sharing a little bit more about technology costs today. Okay. So I just want to start with my key messages right at the beginning. So I'll just go through these points and then kind of elaborate on each one of them in the following slides. First, floating offshore wind energy can help access clean energy wind resources above deep waters. This technology is developing rapidly, and pre-commercial scale projects already operate in Europe and Asia. California really has an opportunity here to become a leader in this emerging industry as the industry scales up and moves towards commercialization. The technology is currently more expensive than fixed bottom offshore wind or land-based wind and solar, but holds promise for substantial cost reduction if we make investments in enabling infrastructure and we are able to scale up production of floating wind components. Last point here, future techno-economic analyses from NREL will focus on quantifying and exploring offshore wind's value proposition more broadly. So, you know, we got a couple questions earlier today about what floating offshore wind is in the chat. So hopefully this slide and the following one can address that. Essentially, wind turbines convert energy in the wind's motion into electricity. The rotor blades turn the generator and send that electricity through underwater cables to the substation and then to shore. Blades are pitched to control the machine, and a yaw system will rotate the nacelle on top of the tower to point into the wind. For the most part, wind turbines are autonomous. They don't need humans on board to operate them unless they're doing scheduled or unexpected maintenance. And offshore wind turbine substructure selection really depends on water depth and soil conditions in a given location. We generally classify these in a couple different ways. So fixed bottom substructures are attached directly to the seabed, and floating substructures rely on mooring lines, tendons, and anchors or piles to attach them to the seabed. Generally speaking, floating designs fall in one of a couple different archetypes, and that's this tension leg platform, spar, and semi-submersible that you see on the right side of this image. All of these technologies are usually assumed to be more cost-effective in water depths beyond 60 meters. So, you know, less than half of 1% of operating floating offshore wind deployment in the world is, less than 0.5% of operating offshore wind technology today is floating. But there's a great potential for that market as other regions seek to access their resources above deep water. Something like 65% of the total US offshore wind resource lies above water depths beyond 60 meters, and that number is 80% in Europe. To meet decarbonization targets and prevent the worst effects from climate change, both offshore and land-based wind resources will likely be needed. So, like I mentioned, floating offshore wind is an emerging technology. We have several operational pre-commercial scale projects. These are smaller than 100 megawatts. And for the most part, these are located in Europe and Asia. The technology is developing rapidly and it's moving towards a commercial scale industry. These are larger utility scale projects on the order of a gigawatt or 1,000 megawatts. Early US floating wind deployment in California can help play a key role in maturing the industry and bringing costs down and cementing California's long legacy of clean energy leadership. And moving towards that gigawatt scale helps the industry benefit from economies of scale, developed supply chains, and continued technology innovation. So back in 2020, NREL estimated the levelized cost of energy, or LCOE, of commercial scale floating offshore wind projects in California. We coordinated with the California Public Utilities Commission and the CAISO for technology data input to the integrated resource planning process. And the figure on the right here shows spatial estimates of levelized cost of energy for a commercial operation date of 2019. Just to unpack LCOE a little bit, because this is a common term that gets used in power system planning efforts. This is really the unit cost of energy over an electricity project's lifetime, and incorporates elements of financing, buying and sourcing, installing all of the different components of the project, running and maintaining the project, and delivering the energy produced every year. It's important to note that LCOE doesn't tell the full story of costs or benefits, but it's really just focused on comparing technologies or projects with different cash flow profiles over time. And it doesn't capture the locational and time value of the energy generated or other services provided by the project. In this study, we explored how wind speed, water depth, and proximity to infrastructure are really critical drivers of spatial variation in offshore wind energy costs. You can see in the figure on the left, the wind resource estimate for California at 100 meters, which is relevant because that was the height of the turbine technology that the project was assuming. I think this technology is evolving rapidly, like I said, and I would probably put that at 150 or 160 meters or higher today, because that's the relevant height for the emerging turbine technology. The figure in the middle shows water depths off the coast of California, and the figure on the right here shows representation of grid infrastructure. Just like other industries, offshore wind was impacted by increases in the cost of capital, commodity prices, and supply chain constraints between 2020 and 2023. And so this graph shows some of the key drivers of recent offshore wind energy costs. You'll note that the secured overnight financing rate is really this part of this cost to borrow. This is affected by interest rates. And because offshore wind assets, just like other renewable energy generation assets, are capital intensive, they're heavily influenced by interest rates. At the same time, prices for major commodities have increased, such as steel, nickel, and copper. Ultimately, this led to news on the East Coast of contract holders in New York trying to rebid their projects and seeking price adjustments from the Public Service Commission of New York. Estimates from a survey of industry participants suggest cost increases in this period range from 11 to 40%, and some even higher than that. It's important to note, though, that this is a really unique window of time where all these factors were changing very dynamically, and some of these cost pressures have already started to ease. Like the Federal Reserve has indicated their intention to drop interest rates further. So I wanted to mention that in light of all of those changes, we've updated modeling approaches to account for these higher costs in some national scale offshore wind assessments. It's important to note that the intent of those national cost assessments isn't necessarily to finance a specific project, but is really focused on capturing long-term trends through 2050. That national focus means that some of those regional or site-specific factors are not captured in that analysis, but these trajectories are still useful for informing how these trends will evolve over time. A few key points to understand if you decide to explore these analyses further. Number one, the rapid evolution of offshore wind costs led to higher uncertainty, which is reflected in 3 cost scenarios shown in the figure on the right. We've updated our cost projection methodology to reflect the transition from a nascent to a mature global floating wind industry. And this differs from previous NREL studies, which assumed mature industry and supply chains and full-scale projects from the beginning. Ultimately, that change results in higher cost estimates than previous work, but demonstrates the long-term potential for cost reduction as the industry matures. Let's see, again, these trajectories are informed by global deployment projections, and those regional or site-specific costs will really depend on investment in enabling infrastructure like ports and grid that allow projects to get built more economically. At a recent industry workshop on floating offshore wind energy costs, 3 keys emerged from participants in their perspectives for achieving cost reductions. These were, number 1, to build at scale. You need sufficient volumes to benefit from economies of scale and achieve serial production or enable mass production. Avoiding one-offs because they're more expensive. Number 2, use what exists. It's really important to leverage existing supply chains, using existing steel grades or thicknesses, using infrastructure that exists, skilled labor and other equipment that you can to the greatest degree possible. It's not always possible to do that. So when you can't, you should standardize for reliability. This involves thinking about interchangeable equipment, skills, components when possible to really maximize the number of potential suppliers, and designing your systems such that you minimize downtime and expensive operations at sea. So this graphic is just showing an example schematic of what a staging and integration port that supports floating offshore wind development might look like. So overall, I'll wrap up by focusing on kind of where we might go in the future with offshore wind economics research at NREL. I think we really want to try to better understand and quantify the technology's value proposition, which includes things like understanding how emissions are affected, how the resource complements other potential clean generation sources, understanding and exploring potential opportunities for domestic manufacturing and supply chain development, exploring energy justice impacts, and understanding the transmission system infrastructure required to deliver the electricity to where it needs to go. Okay, so that concludes my talk today. Thank you for your time, and I will stop sharing my screen here.
Great.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much for that introduction into some of the economics associated with the offshore wind projects. This brings us now to our time to answer some of the questions that you folks have posed. Please, if you have additional questions, please do put those into the Q&A feature. Patrick, if you don't mind sharing one question that has come in. There were two abbreviations that were used,
Oh, yes, sorry.
SOR and CPI. If you don't mind verbally answering that, and then
Yes, sorry. I was trying to go quickly so that we had time for questions here, but CPI is the Consumer Price Index. I can share my screen again here. So yeah, this was kind of in the conversation around interest rates and dynamic commodity prices, but really SOFR is the secured overnight financing rate, and CPI is the Consumer Price Index. The Consumer Price Index is one metric for inflation, and the secured overnight financing rate is a driver of the cost to borrow or the interest rates that someone looking to finance a project might face.
thank you very much for that clarification. So at this point, we've got a few questions coming in, and I'll ask folks to answer those. Real quick, we had a clarification on the question that had been asked about, what impact is associated with these offshore wind projects and climate. And here's the statement that Mike was referring to in the final environmental impact statement. This was for Vineyard Wind with their project off of Martha's Vineyard. The quotes from the report were, this is from the, again, final environmental impact statement. Quote, overall, it is anticipated that there would be a net reduction in greenhouse gas emissions and no collective adverse impact on climate change as a result of offshore wind projects. It would result in a net decrease in overall emissions over the region compared to the installation of a traditional fossil fuel power generating station. And in context of reasonably foreseeable environmental trends, combined emission impacts on air quality from ongoing and planned actions within the geographic analysis area would help reduce fossil fuel emissions and would result in an overall moderate beneficial impact on air quality. So that, for those who are interested, page A57, A58 of the Bureau of Energy Management's final environmental impact statement for Vineyard Wind off the coast of Martha's Vineyard. And in addition, for those who are interested in this topic, there is a recent report that came from Resources for the Future. It is not West Coast based, but it is a report titled Offshore Wind Power Examined, Effects, Benefits, and Costs of Offshore Wind Farms along the US Atlantic and Gulf Coast. And based on their analysis, they conclude that a series of projects that they have modeled would reduce 1,600 premature deaths from climate change globally. So you may want to look at that report. For questions, I'd like to ask Dr. Southall. We have a question here about one of the reports that you were sharing regarding the offshore wind site assessments. How do we know that there are not whale and other cetacean strandings associated with these projects? If you could give a little bit more depth on that comment.
Sure. Yeah, and I pointed to the paper by Leslie Thorne that goes into a lot more detail on this. I mean, one of the main reasons to indicate, that the strandings off of New York and New Jersey are not associated with the operation of offshore wind is the fact that there's no operating turbines off of New York and New Jersey. So there have been some surveys that have occurred in those areas. They've had pretty extensive monitoring associated with them, but the bigger picture pattern that paper highlights is the unusual mortality event that started was identified for humpback whales precedes any of those type of surveys and is associated with near shore. Almost all of the documented cases of humpback whale mortalities are vessel strikes. And in the last 10 years, there's been a strong increase in the near shore presence and foraging of humpback whales associated with climatic changes, climate change or just otherwise shifts of menhaden presence close to shore and the presence of those animals in shipping channels. So essentially all the mortality that's been identified. There's some that have been unidentified, which is common for stranded marine mammals that are, have been stranded for a longer time. But almost all those that have been identified are vessel strikes, and vessel strikes not associated with the operation of offshore wind turbines, which haven't been installed in those areas yet.
Thank you very much. A question for Patrick Duffy, if you don't mind answering. One of the participants wanted to know if there's an accepted figure for the net benefits of offshore wind projects, and whether those are being used in the cost benefit analysis. And if they're not being used, is that leading to some inaccuracies?
It's a good question. I personally haven't been involved in quantifying every single benefit of a specific project. So, I'm not able to tell you what that figure might be for a specific place and time at the current moment. I know of at least one study on the East Coast that focused on trying to quantify the benefits from offshore wind build out along the East Coast and in the Gulf of Mexico. I think I already shared that link in the chat. If you don't see that, it's a study from Resources for Future. If you don't see that, let me know, and I can point you in the right direction there.
Thank you very much. So just as a reminder, as additional questions are coming in, all of the recordings for these webinars, and there are 3 webinars, are all, you can find them on the Uniting the Central Coast for Action Slow Climate Coalition webpage. Again, that's the Uniting the Central Coast for Action Slow Climate Coalition webpage. And they'll also be available on YouTube. So any of the links that I'm talking about now will be shared with anyone who registered on email. So additional questions here. A question thinking here. One of the questions about turbine generated infrasonic noise on bird, whale, and tuna navigation cues. I think that may be something, Brandon, that you're also familiar with. Someone is sharing one of their papers here. If you don't mind offering some knowledge here on the infrasonic noise.
Yeah, I think it is an area that we definitely have very little information on, both in terms of the very low frequency, ultra low frequency sounds that some of these arrays of really large turbines generate. Most of the monitoring has gone down to 10 hertz or even 5 hertz, but some of the considerations and physiological impacts are in the even lower frequencies. So first of all, we lack some information about the knowledge of what types of those fields may be generated by these things. And we also don't have direct information about those kind of physiological effects. So I think it is in one of those categories of things that are important considerations. We know that some of the animals that migrate long distances are using some combination of acoustic or other cues to find their way over really long distances in ways that we don't fully understand. So I think that it's an area that we don't have enough information about what the exposure is and what the effects are. And I've seen a couple of recent publications in medical journals about that. You're at the really, really low frequencies, you're talking about things in your body like heart rate frequencies and vestibular systems and things that aren't really the kind of acoustic effects that have been the subject of a lot of the monitoring. So it's definitely an area of needed information.
And this next question, I think, is for both you, Brendan, and also Mike. A question about the regional sharing of marine science and data sets in order to further the sort of data sharing that's necessary to inform any responsible development. So I don't know, perhaps Mike, would you like to start first, and then Brandon will ask for your input also, please.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. You know, it'll be it's highly important that whatever data is generated, collected, and science that comes out of this is shared across the board, right? If it's siloed and doesn't get out there, then we can't really make those informed decisions. You know, we've been working with NIMS, National Marine Fisheries Service, and others, and kind of trying to help them frame research topics that we think are important. But to the, you know, when that study's done, you know, that information has to be collected, coordinated, and then presented in a way that is easily understood, which typically is something that, no offense to the scientists on the panel here, but you know, the science community, when presenting to the fishing industry and others, there's often a disconnect because it seems like we're talking past each other rather than to each other or with each other.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. I think it's, you know, there's definitely a need for transparency and access and accessibility to information like passive acoustic data that's being collected by all these different, you know, subsets of entities, and having that available and utilized and integrated with other systems is all important. I think some of the work on the East Coast that's being coordinated through the Regional Wildlife Science Collective, RWSC, is a good model for some of that. But I agree with Mike 100% that, you know, accessibility and, you know, just having it all available is not necessarily good enough. It's having it available and interpreted in and interpretable in a useful way. And some of the things that we've tried to do with some of these risk assessment approaches is taking really complex type of spatial, temporal, spectral noise relationship data and putting them into understandable risk factors that you can explain to someone that isn't doesn't have a lot of scientific expertise. So it's, yeah, I echo what Mike says. There's accessibility, standardization, related things, and we have some good models for some of that from the East Coast, but making things interpretable and understandable and meaningful is really important.
A lot of interest in the science. And so, Brenda, if I can keep you on the hot seat here, there's some questions here about there's been site surveys that have been started off of the Central Coast. And one of the questions is the availability of some of that information. Will that become publicly available? If you don't mind also commenting on some of the work that the Western region, the NOAA scientists, they have a scientific plan that they're going to be embarking on that was recently released, if you don't mind commenting on that. Oops, sorry, if you don't mind unmuting.
Yeah, sorry, I caught it. I was just gonna say, I'm not sure I can speak to the timeliness and accessibility of the industry collected data. I know, you know, some of the, yeah, I'm not sure about that, about the timeliness of that or the availability of that. On the second point, I'll just say the risk, I went through it really quickly, but that risk assessment vulnerability study we did was funded by BOEM. It's publicly available, and was coordinated with and informed by the NOAA team that developed the science plan that they're talking about. So, you know, a lot of the needs that were identified, you know, included, you know, still some pretty basic things about, you know, we have some geographical, and we have some seasonal biases in our understanding about when and where some of these species are present, including, you know, key species, but, you know, less common species. And so, yeah, I guess my comment would be there's a science plan they've released that includes a fair bit of monitoring, but also a fair bit of ecological modeling, because we're not going to have, you know, enough time to collect all the data that you would want to have in some of these areas. It's kind of ironic that the areas off Morro Bay and off Humboldt are some of the areas where we don't have, like in Southern California, we've had the Cal Coffee surveys for a really long time. There's, Navy ranges. So there's been a lot of monitoring. We've had these coastwide surveys of distribution and density that people have done. But in places here like Monterey Bay, where I am, and San Francisco Bay and the Farallones, there's been a lot of effort in visual surveys and tagging. But the two areas that we have, there's some gaps, especially during some of the seasons of the year, like the winter, when there's just not much effort there. So yeah, targeting, the monitoring. And I guess the last thing I'll say is that some of the NOAA folks are directly contributing to the monitoring guidance process that I mentioned that's happening through OPC. So we're trying to incorporate some of that into the monitoring plans for the state, which the state, hopefully state and federal agencies, as well as the industry, will be contributing to some of the monitoring that actually finally occurs, or that is occurring and will be increasing.
Great. No, that's super helpful. And we will be sending out as to the folks who are participating a link to the science plan so that you can have a chance to review the contents of that plan. We have a question. I'm going to apologize again, Brandon. There's a great deal of interest in these topics here. If you can talk a little bit about what potential impacts there can be through survey technology. In particular, that survey technology used in offshore wind is different than the seismic survey work that's done by the oil and gas industry. And if you can comment on that. And we have a question that somebody has asked about whether the impacts of the mapping is emitting noises up to 190 decibels at 9 hertz as the sort of zone of influence. And someone has asked the question here, and you maybe can explain what the zone of influence is also here. Someone has asked, should the zone of influence be extended to 1,800 meters instead of 500 meters due to new studies, and whether there's going to be new studies similar to what a researcher at Finneran did in his 2023 study?
Okay, there was a lot there. I'll try. I think so one really important distinction between other offshore energy surveys and the kinds of surveys that they're doing for the siting and, safe deployment of offshore wind technology is just how far into the earth you're looking. A lot of the things that the wind energy companies for, sediment features, but fine scale bathymetry, and what are often called shallow hazard surveys, where you're going to put something that's fairly heavy. You don't want to put it on a gas pocket or a small micro fault. The people that are using full-scale seismic surveys, like compressed air guns in large arrays, they're imaging much deeper in the ground. They're looking for salt domes. They're looking for features that house reservoirs of hydrocarbons, or for research surveys, they're looking for plate tectonic features that are kilometers into the ground, not tens of meters into the ground. So that means that the power between those two things is very different. They typically, the really deep ones have to, just by the nature of physics, involve very low frequencies. The more fine scale you want to look, it's like, why do dolphins and bats have echolocation that you can't hear? It's because to find something small or to look at fine scale features, you need higher frequencies to resolve it. So many of the kind of mapping systems that are used are at frequencies we can't hear. Some of them are at frequencies the animals can't hear. The comment that was made about lower frequencies. So when you get below, some of these animals can hear up to hundreds of kilohertz. Porpoises can hear, close to 200 kilohertz. And it just depends on the species, how far down the map that they hear. Some of the systems that operate in the 9, or some of the systems that we know have been associated with concerns and stranding events, previously the only kind of multi-beam system we're aware of that was associated with a stranding event was at 12 kilohertz. And those are the sort of the most powerful multi-beam systems that are used. My understanding is, well, I know for a fact that those kind of systems have not been used in the surveys on the East Coast, that they're not planned for use on the West Coast, and that many of the systems that they're operating on the West Coast will be from submerged vehicles that will be flying near the seafloor as opposed to towed from the surface. Part of the reason that those lower frequency ones that the animals can, really all the marine mammals can hear 9 kilohertz, 12 kilohertz. It's right in the range. We can hear it. It's in the range of kind of best sensitivity. So, I think collectively people have done kind of a risk assessment of frequency and power and identified these systems that operate at lower frequencies and at higher powers as being a higher risk than things that are really at the high end of the spectrum. There's also the sort of physics of how things travel. The higher the frequency, the zone of influence basically is what is the area over which a sound could have a certain level of effect. And they're often drawn as like symmetrical polygons, right, or circles, which doesn't exist in the real world. Things reflect and bounce differently, but the area over which something would have an effect. I mean, the higher you go in frequency, the smaller that area gets because of the way physics works. So it is a complex kind of interaction of frequency and power, and we know that ones that are at lower frequencies and higher power are more likely to be detectable over larger distances. The multi-beam systems that I'm talking about, I mean, 190 sounds like a lot because people are used to in-air sounds, but whales can make sounds that are approaching 190 decibels. Ships have sounds that are in that kind of power range. Vessels, echo sounders that recreational boats have are in those types of power ranges. Again, it just depends on the frequency. So I think my overall point would be the systems that are at the lower frequencies are ones we need to pay more attention to. And I think it's fair to note that in some of these deeper water places that we have off the West Coast, you have some species that we've never dealt with in assessing the impacts of offshore wind before because no one's operated in beaked whale habitat. We know beaked whales are more sensitive to underwater sound. So it's just I think we can take some of the mapping systems and put them in a less concern, and some of the ones that are in these ranges that more animals can hear in something we need to consider a little bit more. But to me, it's really good news that most of the surveys that they're planning on doing on the West Coast are going to involve things that are flying right above the seafloor. Therefore, they don't have to have the power to go through 1,000 meters of water, which is, probably driven by the physics of where they want to do it. But I know that considerations about impacts has been at least part of the conversation.
Thank you very much. We have a question for Patrick here, asking about the cost benefit analysis and whether you can share a little bit more about the California Public Utility Commissions, how they approach their cost benefit analysis based on your knowledge of how this work is done.
Sure, yeah, let me find a couple of resources on that. I think so I guess cost benefit analysis broadly is a wide topic. Let me try to get my video going here. The CPUC recently opted to procure, I think, 7.6, something on the order of 7.6 gigawatts through a centralized procurement mechanism. That's along with some other technologies, emerging technologies like, I want to say geothermal was on the list of technologies they were considering. But they looked at an analysis of grid transmission infrastructure needed and technology cost estimates under a number of different scenarios to explore that. Let me see if I can find a document there. Again, I think most analyses are not quantifying every benefit and every cost, but something like that where you look at grid impacts and technology costs was part of their thinking around centralized procurement for floating offshore wind, as well as the potential for cost reduction over time as the industry matures. So let me find a resource on that and I'll share that in the chat.
Thank you very much. And our final question for the evening, or afternoon, I'm sorry, is about impacts. And this is for Brandon and Mike, if you'd like to address this, what the acoustic or electromagnetic frequency impacts may be on marine life from the cabling on the offshore wind projects. So if both of you would like to comment on that, that would be very helpful. So maybe Mike, if you want to start, and then Brandon.
Yeah, largely unknown. There are some studies that have been done in Europe and on the Atlantic briefly, and I mentioned it earlier. They have shown that some crab species don't react well to it. I think sharks are another species that don't react well to the electromagnetic fields. But to the extent that, and I think Brandon references as well with regard to species that are specific to the West Coast, there just hasn't been much research done on that. I know that's a big concern with the fishing industry, especially with the the dependence that salmon has on being able to migrate to the river of birth. If there are any impacts to their navigation, their internal navigation systems from the EMF, it would be interesting and good to know.
Yeah, not much more to add. That's my, understanding of it. There's the sort of obvious concern about animals we know use electromagnetic fields like skates and rays and benthic organisms and respond to them. It's not well known whether marine mammals do or don't. I wouldn't be surprised if they do. They have a sort of a suite of sensory abilities that they integrate to do really hard things like swim 10,000 miles in the dark and navigate under ice and places like that involve kind of an integration of things. But yeah, it really hasn't been studied in marine mammals. There, like he said, there's been work on benthic fish and invertebrates.
Thank you very much. So we have come to the end of this webinar, and thank you all for your excellent participation and for each of the panelists. Any comments because there's been a lot of resources that have been discussed today. These will be shared to all participants, and please join me in thanking all of the excellent presentations that we received today and all of our sponsors for this programming, as well as the team that worked really hard to bring all these speakers to you. Please let us know in email when you receive the link to today's webinar. Please let us know if there are additional topics that you would like to be addressed in the future. So that brings us to a close, and thank you again very much for all of your participation.